All right, welcome back to another episode of the Black Bullion Show. Now, this one is going to be big. Why? Because we are going to be talking about secret deals between banks, the Fed. We're going to be talking about falling savings rates, and we're going to be talking about crushing consumer debt. All three of these things are a recipe for economic disaster. Now, if you are new here, please subscribe to the channel. Also, like the video to help get this economic evangelism out there. And also, if you don't want to watch the full video, check out the description where I'll give a brief synopsis of the video. So let's get into it. Now, if you've been following this channel for some time, you know that I have been talking a lot about velocity and inflation and why it has not gone up since the 2008 financial crisis. Now, we haven't seen rampant inflation since post 2008. In fact, since 2000, we've actually seen a slow decrease in the velocity of cash. Now, what is velocity? That's how many times the cash changes over in a society. Now, if velocity is low, it doesn't matter how much money you print. The GDP of an economy is based on a simple formula: M2 money stock multiplied by the velocity, which will give you your GDP. Now, our velocity has been going lower since 2000. And since 2008, it made a sharp decrease. And since then, it's been slowly going down. Now, why is that? Well, you may remember, and I have some notes here, that during 2008, a whole bunch of things were happening. A whole bunch of policies were put in place. One of them that might have snuck through that you might not have been aware of is what happened to excess reserves in the financial system. Now, what happened to excess reserves in the financial system? Well, since October 1st, 2008, banks have been earning interest on the excess reserves that they keep at the Federal Reserve. Now, remember, during this time, up until now, really, banks were only required to keep 10% of their money at their location, whereas the majority of that, 90%, could then be offloaded onto, they would be counted as excess reserves and saved at the Federal Reserve. And since 2008, as that 90% could be saved with the Federal Reserve would then pay interest to banks. Now, how? They would do that with money printing. That's how they would pay the interest. Now, how do banks receive this money? Well, it would be counted as interest income that they then have to pay to the Treasury. Now, remember, the Fed buys treasuries. So it's this continuous spiral into insolvency that we are seeing, prompted by partially this excess reserve law. Now, here's the shocking part. Well, actually, let me go down and read a little bit of what had been happening since 2008. So excess reserves for banks hit a record of 2.7 trillion in August of 2014 due to the quantitative easing program. In mid-June 2016, excess reserves stood at 2.3 trillion. Proceeds from quantitative easing were paid out to banks by the Federal Reserve in the form of reserves, not cash. However, the interest paid on these reserves is paid out in cash and recorded as interest income for the receiving bank. I just said that, so there it is again. The interest paid out to banks from the Federal Reserve is cash that would otherwise be going to the U.S. Treasury. Now, check this out. This is actually a pretty interesting this is actually pretty interesting about what the Federal Reserve can do with the interest on excess reserves and the federal funds rate. Now, historically, the Fed funds rate is the rate at which banks lend money to one another and is often used as a benchmark for variable rate loans. Both the interest on reserves and the interest on excess reserves are determined by the Federal Reserve, specifically the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. As a result, banks had an incentive to hold excess reserves, especially when market rates are below the Fed funds rate. In this way, the interest rate on excess reserves served as a proxy for the Fed funds rate. The Federal Reserve alone has the power to change this rate, the Federal Reserve alone, which increased to 0.5% on December 17th, 2015, after nearly a decade of lower bound interest rates. Since then, the Fed has been using the interest on excess reserves to create a band between the Fed funds rate and the interest on excess reserves by setting it purposefully below to keep their target rates on track. For example, in December 2018, the Fed raised its target rate by 25 basis points, but only raised the interest on excess reserves by 20 basis points. This gap makes excess reserves another policy tool of the Fed. If the economy is heating up too fast, the Fed can shift up its interest on excess reserves to encourage more capital to be parked at the Fed, slowing growth in available capital and increasing resiliency in the banking system. As of yet, however, the policy tool has not been tested in a challenging economy. Now, this was written before the crisis that we're going through right now, so we'll see how that plays out. But as you can see here, if the interest on excess reserves is raised, that means that money that could have been lent out by banks will then just be parked into the Federal Reserve, thus causing less velocity in the economy. This is one of the reasons on the corporate level why we have had lessened velocity. But here is one of the shocking parts. This is straight up from the Federal Reserve's website. Now, you might have remembered this back in March, but I'm just going to read this really quickly, the last paragraph here. These were updated reserve requirements that the Federal Reserve announced back in March. Here's what the last paragraph says. In light of the shift to an ample reserves regime, the board has reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0% effective on March 26th, the beginning of the next reserve maintenance period. This action eliminates reserve requirements for thousands of depository institutions and will help to support lending to households and businesses. Yeah, right. Because here's one of the reasons why. For example, J.P. Morgan and Chase has tightened their lending, for weeks now. You can only get a mortgage if you have a credit score of 700 or higher, and if you can only put a down payment of 20% down. They've tightened their lending restrictions. In addition to that, now that they don't have to have that extra 10% sitting, they can park that money in the Federal Reserve and then start earning more interest from the Federal Reserve. And remember, the Federal Reserve is printing like crazy right now. So it's not going to encourage more lending for households or more lending for businesses. In fact, it's just going to cause more a lessened velocity in the economy, and it's going to cause banks to just hoard more money in their excess reserves. So now excess reserves can now go up to 100% as opposed to having a ceiling of only 90%. This is huge and will cause a plunge in velocity in the banking sector, in the corporate level. Now you may be asking, well, what about the velocity on the public side? So we just learned about the corporate side, but what about the public? So here is one of the reasons why the public has had a lessened velocity, and one of the reasons is because of the savings is because of the savings rate. A quick fall, essentially for the savings rate, a quick fall from a high savings rate spurs quickened velocity, even for a short period of time, from a sluggish velocity. Now, those of you who may be aware of the savings rate differences, pre-World War II to after World War II, the savings rate was way higher pre-World War II, and we had an economy of strong savers. Then after a quick cut of the savings rate, we had spenders, and the economy just came out of a deficit and had more of a surplus during that time. The problem is when you cut rates, savings rates, and it's not from an extremely high point, you won't get that initial spike in spending. However, back in the early 80s, there was a cut and you start to see increased spending. And that's one of the reasons why we had higher velocity from that 1980 to 1999 period. We had a slow, we had a cut of the savings rate, and more people were spending in the economy. And then we had the recession. And then after that, people started to huddle more money into their accounts. Now, take a look at one of these. Take a look at. I'm just going to read this right here. We're going to continue with the savings rate. This actually comes from Seeking Alpha and partially from Lacey Hunt, who is an amazing economist. Just going to read this quick brief right here. We're going to talk about the World War II, or what happened in World War I and World War II. Not only were the soldiers returning home to work in the private sector again, those at home shifted from wartime frugality to peacetime abundance. The savings rate plummeted as spending resumed, generating economic activity and growth. The same happened in the years after World War I. Something similar, though more drawn out, happened from the mid-1980s to the 2000s. As interest rates fell starting in the early 1980s, the personal savings rate likewise fell. Take a look at this graph here. Around the mid-1980s, you have the personal savings rate, which is in red, falling, and then you also have the velocity of the M2 money stock increasing during this period, hitting its peak in the late 90s, and then slowly dropping. This is where we are right now. Well, actually, that's more so where we are in 2018. We've actually gone lower than that now. So we've just been on a drop ever since the 2000s as far as the velocity has been concerned. Now, the savings rate slowly start to go up in the mid 2000s. It's been a little bit up since then, and obviously the velocity has decreased. Now, we're actually going to skip down here because I already kind of talked about that. But here's the thing. Since the Great Recession, the correlation between the savings rate and the money velocity appears to have been broken. Perhaps this is mainly due to the fact that the majority of savings since then has been done by the wealthy. See, for instance, the following statistics aggregated last year. So take a look at this. I'm not going to look at the median as much as I'm going to look at, or the average as much as I'm going to look at the median. So take a look at this. This is the average savings broken out by essentially quintiles, or actually no, I guess you could say sextiles here of the economy broken out. You have the upper 1%, upper 10%, and then so on and so forth. Obviously, um, the higher you are in society, the more you've been saving. And take a look at the median households of all households, in the lower two brackets, they have been saving nothing. And only really until you've gotten to the middle section have you started to see increases. Now, this is the median households with savings. And still, the bottom bracket has no savings. Now, you may be wondering why, and we'll get to that soon, but we're going to end off right here. The upper 40%, and especially the top 10%, do the vast majority of spending. It may very well be the case that the additional economic activity generated from a falling savings rate was exhausted when the bottom 90% hit 0% of personal income saved. When did this occur? Around the late 1990s, right at the peak of money velocity. Coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, the last time the savings rate of the bottom 90% hit zero was following World War I, when the money velocity had just peaked in 1918. Now, you may be wondering, well, why are they not saving as much money? Okay, we know that something happened with the savings rate here, but why have they not been saving as much? And it's partially due to this: crushing debt. Now, this comes from the Center for Microeconomic Data from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, here are the total balances of non-household and household debt, but I'm going to show you the breakdown of non-household debt. So first we'll start there. Non-housing debt balance. Take a look at the peaks right around the last crisis. Take a look at the distribution between student loans, other, credit card, and auto loans. Now, red is student loan, other is gray, credit cards are yellow, and auto loans are green. Now, there were some laws put in place around the mid 2000s, which essentially hampered the ability for people to take out, or hampered the ability of banks to lend credit cards in ways that they were doing in the past. So that's one of the reasons why that hasn't increased as much over time. But take a look at what's been increasing over time. Pretty much, it's student loans and auto loans. Now, you might have been hearing about the student loan issue, but you might not be that aware of what's been going on with auto loans. But if you've been taking out auto loans recently, you might have been told by the banks or whoever you were working with at the dealership who was working with banks that they are now offering 7-year auto loans. Yeah, you heard that right. They are now offering 7-year auto loans for cars now, because people simply just can't afford paying for it right now. They have to essentially kind of kick the can down the road. People essentially don't have money anymore. And that's one of the reasons why velocity has slowed so much, because people are paying off debt and they're trying to save as much as they can. They are not spending money in the way that they were spending money in the 90s. It's just not happening because people are saddled with debt, and they're trying to save as much as they can, and they're not making that much money. Take a look at how things have just shot up with the student loan rate, and people are going into college, and it hasn't really slowed. People are continuously going into college, and they're coming out with more and more debt. Now, when this stops, I have no idea, but this is a problem. And as far as household debt is concerned, it's right here in the blue. Non-household debt is in the red. So the blue hasn't really been much of an increase since the last recession, but for household debt, it's essentially risen by 1% since the last recession. So not extremely much of a difference here. Right now, it's at 10.10 trillion. The peak was around 9.99 trillion. So roughly 1% increase since the recession. Now, what about non-household debt? The peak for non-household debt was 2.71 trillion, and now it's at 4.2. So that's roughly a 35% increase since the last recession. And why is that? It is because primarily of student loan debt and auto loan debt. That is the majority of that breakdown. So it pretty much has been pieced together here. If you want to know why inflation has been running rampant, it's because on the corporate side with banks, they are incentivized essentially, especially when the economy becomes hot, to park their money with the Fed, and the Fed will pay them with printed money that they essentially on their balance sheet have treasuries on their balance sheet. And guess who pays into the U.S. Treasury? Banks, who get who get interest income from the Fed. So they banks are incentivized to continue to park their money there, and after March 26th, they can park all of their money there if they want to, and they've tightened up lending. So you have that. And then on the public side, they're being saddled with debt. So here's the thing. We will not see rampant inflation until the debt issue has been solved, and until banks are not incentivized and paid interest to keep their money with the Fed. Now, you may be asking, what does that mean for those of us who are interested in gold and silver? I still say the same thing. Right now, gold is in a bull market. And even though we may not see those crazy highs that people have been suggesting, like 100,000 or what have you, even though it should be that way, one of the reasons why is because of all this funny business that's happening in the economy. I still think that we will have a higher gold and a higher silver price. And I've done some projections in prior videos, but I believe the reason why we aren't going to see those crazy highs like we should see is because of this velocity issue. And until that is solved, we will have rises in the gold price and the silver price, but we won't have those crazy highs. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. With all this data that I threw at you, I'm going to, again, put this in the description as sources for this video, so check those out. But let me know what you think in the comment section below about all this stuff I mentioned: the deals happening between the banks and the Fed, the falling savings rates, sparking, or I should say, unfortunately, not sparking spending. Well, I should say the falling savings rates have now risen a little bit, so rising savings rates a little bit, and also crushing consumer debt. Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you so much for your time. I know this was a lot, so thank you for watching this video. Please like the video. Please subscribe if you are new. And once again, it's Black Bullion.